Thank you for staying with us. With 8 successful coups in the past 3 years alone, many people have expressed concerns over the coup epidemic in Africa. But the continent is no stranger to coups, having intermittently grappled with the rise and fall of military regimes since decolonization. Roughly 44% of the 242 successful coups since 1950 have been in Africa. Hard data suggests a wide gap between the lived experience of democracy in large parts of the continent and the hopes that people have pinned on the system of governance. Let's speak to Doctoral Research Fellow Dr. Chidochashe Nyere. Dr. Nyere, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Now, given the recent surge in military takeovers across the continent, what underlying factors do you believe have contributed to the growing support for such interventions, particularly among the civilian population?
Good afternoon, Shansha, and good afternoon to the viewers. So what we sit with, particularly in the Sahel region, the West Africa region, which has been dubbed the coup belt of Africa, but it's also across all of Africa in terms of the coups that have taken place. What we are sitting with is a dissimulation between the state and the nation. Now, those words are used interchangeably, but they mean two distinct things. When we speak about the state, we are necessarily speaking of a model that borrows from the Westphalian concept of state. In other words, it's a European creation, and it may have worked in Europe. However, in Africa, it has proven to be problematic. Yet, when we speak about the nation, we are speaking about the people in a country. So in terms of what the people hoped for, especially here in Africa, at the onset of democratic rule in terms of Africa and Africa determining itself. So there hasn't really been much transition in terms of the lived experience of people in their nations vis-a-vis people when they used to live under colonial rule. And this is what is being expressed particularly in these coups, where people seemingly are very supportive of these coups. In other words, what we are seeing now departs from what we had observed prior to this. Coups were frowned upon. But of late, we find that these coups seem to be receiving popular support, and because the nations are disgruntled with the model of the state. In other words, the institution of the state is under siege. The institution of the state is not delivering what it promised to deliver. So this is where the issue is.
Dr. Nyere, one article that we've sourced suggests that weak democratic processes, especially in Francophone West Africa, as well as the Sahel region, have led to this growing dissatisfaction. In your view, what specific aspects of these democratic processes have failed to meet the expectations of the local population?
So maybe let's first unpack that very notion of democracy. Because with democracy, there is also democracy. Now, with democracy, I know popularly we know it as the rule by the people. So demos are the people. Kratos is the rule, right? So democracy simply means the rule of the people. Now, what we are sitting with are the blind spots, what I call the democracy, the demons of democracy, meaning there are some blind spots that democracy comes with. So it's embedded in democracy. In other words, when you look at George Orwell, there is a famous book that he penned called Animal Farm, where he keeps that all animals are equal. But we know how that ended. Some animals proved to be more equal than others. So too with democracy. When we speak about the rule of the people, we then have to be asking ourselves which people, right? Who are the people? Because with democracy, you will end up talking about the majoritarian rule, meaning the majority in any country have to rule. But we also know, and I want to caution, when it comes to democracy, it's not always the majority that's right, because there are also minorities that need protection. So unless we understand what it is that we are speaking about when we use such terms as democracy, we are bound to run into problems. Maybe I just want to highlight that the democracy that you are speaking about, which is popularly popularly conceived, it is a democracy that is statist, right? Yeah. So it's a top-down approach. It's statist. In other words, when you look at Western style of democracy, it would actually argue that these coups are undemocratic because they are disposing of elected officials. But if you look at the nations, the people, because seemingly these coups are receiving so much popular support, then it actually tells us that the people are disgruntled with the state model, and therefore the people are actually reconfiguring or reimagining the very concept of democracy. In other words, we are now sitting with an African style of democracy vis-a-vis the Western style of democracy.
So economic challenges, including corruption and high living costs, are also mentioned as the driving forces behind public support for coups. How do you see economic conditions shaping the political landscape? And do you think these conditions can be addressed within the democratic framework?
So it is very difficult to address the economic conditions in this democratic framework, the Western style of democracy. Maybe let's paint a picture again. So when we speak of African liberation movements, I'm referring to those parties, those political parties that brought and ushered in democracy in all of Africa, right? But we know that it is problematic that these so-called liberation movements have actually now become the native colonizers of Africa because they have continued with the agenda that was set in the West, right? The Westphalian agenda of conquering Africa. So in terms of the economic model, as long as we sit with this capitalist economic model, we will not really reverse anything because the capitalist model, firstly, it is hierarchical. And the hierarchy has to do with skin color. So at the apex of this hierarchy are white and the Caucasian race. At the base, you find the black and the African. So it is hierarchical in its nature. And it tends to be very racist. And it tends to be very gendered. It does not favor women who, by the way, form the bulk of the population in African countries anyway. So unless we transform this economic model, it doesn't matter whether we follow the Western style of democracy or the African style of democracy. We will not change anything unless we address the very fundamental issue, which is economic in nature. So I tend to agree with what you are proposing, that unless we deal with the economic structure, the politics really are just baloney.
So the influence of former colonial powers like France and other global players is also highlighted. In what ways do you think the involvement of the international actors has also impacted the dynamics of governance and political stability in the region?
So you will always find that in Africa we will almost be appealing to former colonial masters because they are involved in all this, by the way. So the very fact that these liberation movements that I spoke about fought against these former colonial masters, it is telling in itself that the liberation movements that really were comprised of African nationalists were disgruntled with the economic model of exclusion. So the capitalist model always excluded Africa, and this is what informed and forced liberation movements to take up arms to fight that system. However, that system has not been dismantled because something else has survived colonialism, right? We can argue that colonialism in its physical essence has ended. However, it has been survived by coloniality. And by coloniality, I'm speaking of the very templates of action, templates of being, templates of thought that were instituted by colonialism. So in its physical absence, it is still very much alive. And hence, the colonial masters, the very beneficiaries of this colonial system, still are beneficiaries today. And this is where I think our liberation movements in Africa have failed us, because they failed to transform or to translate their struggle into the economy so that it is a leveled play field where Africans can participate in that economy. As it is, these are ceremonial participations of Africans because at the end of the day, the drivers of the economy are still in the hands of former colonizers, unfortunately.
Dr. Nyere, looking ahead, what are the potential consequences for the region if the current trend of military takeovers continues? And how might extremist groups exploit the instability which has been created by coups? And what strategies do you think can be effective in also preventing further unrest?
So yes, there are many ramifications of these coups if they are let to continue. However, the transformation has to happen not only in terms of the military juntas that run these institutions after takeover. The transformation really has to do with the civic space, the civil space.
Yeah.
And I think the first thing, and I've said this elsewhere, Africa needs to unite. So the unification of Africa is very important because as we are fragmented and we are very easy to manipulate, particularly by global powers. So unless we are united or we amalgamate in action and being, it is very difficult to maneuver the capitalist system. So that's the first thing. Secondly, our militaries have to come together. In other words, the insurgency that has been happening, the extremists that you speak about, they also are used sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes they are used by these former colonizers because they have a bond to chew naturally. So they are used, in other words, we are being pitted one against the other because we are fragmented. So if we had one Africa in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of our governance, in terms of our economy, and in terms of our security and the military, chances are we will still be discussing how best to approach this. So a uniform approach is what is likely to cure all the insurgency and the coups, because then we will have one seat of power.
Dr. Nyere, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. That was Dr. Chidochashe Nyere. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at UJ, speaking on various aspects of the coup epidemic, from its root causes and economic dimensions to the role of international actors, as well as potential future scenarios.